Okay, yo. This is the very interesting topic to me personally. It's the rise of the trauma essay in college applications by Tina Wong. Let's read the so as if college applications aren't stressful enough, disadvantaged youth are often encouraged to write about their darkest traumas in their admissions essays, creating a marketable story of resilience that turns pain into progress, says politics student Tina Wong. She brings this harrowing norm to light, exposing its harm and offering a more equitable process for colleges everywhere. Okay. Uh, I don't know what's this gonna be about, but I feel like we live in a world whereby I don't know. We kind of reduce people to like their limitations, I would say, but and try to define them as such. Even in the opportunities that we offer to them, we still remind them where they belong, type of thing. And I feel like this is the angle she's going through. I haven't heard of her before, but I'll definitely give her a follow because I think whenever people have a bit more nuanced conversations about things like this, because no one ever, because everyone is just arguing about affirmative actions, arguing about critical race theory, arguing about this, but they fail to realize what actually happens to like less privileged people when they are in such situations, how are they perceived, you know? All right, let's see here. All right.
There's a story of mine that I've told about a million different times, and it goes a little something like this. When I was 10, my family and I packed up our entire lives into large suitcases and dragged them across the Pacific to a foreign land called Canada. I was put in a school where I was the only Asian kid in my grade, and I got teased for my broken English, Asian features, and funny smelling ethnic lunches. The racism was a real doozy. But don't feel bad. Through the magical healing powers of extracurricular activities and pure perseverance, I stand before you today a new woman, healthy, healed, and extremely employable. You wouldn't even be able to tell from just looking at me that I was once the weird little immigrant girl who begged her mom to pack PB&J sandwiches so she wouldn't have to eat lunch alone in the bathroom. This is a story that I've told in academic essays, job interviews, and even in the very application that got me into this fine university. It's also a story that, despite all of its truth, I've come to hate. Now, this is a story that I don't.
Yeah, that's wow. Wow, like I kind of like the opening. That's one thing I like about TED Talks. The best speakers speak, and I kind of like the way she set it up, like an introduction that she has introduced herself to presumably audiences that she perceived she wanted to be a part of or trying to get acceptance from, not just university acceptance, but being accepted as a human being form. And I think it's kind of interesting, like when the way she talks about how she hated that, and I'm gonna let her elaborate on what she hated about it, uh, and I'm trying to see if is it more to do with how she ends up seeing herself constantly, or how she ends up being perceived eternally. Like despite her having overcame and all those, which is true, like is that all we see with her? Is there more to her as an individual, or is she just this caricature of an individual that overcame? So, all right, let's keep it going.
don't have copyright claim over. It's one that continues to be regurgitated by immigrant kids all across the country to be served on a silver platter to prestigious universities who chew these stories and spit out acceptance letters in return. The contents of the story may change. Instead of a difficult immigration experience, it might be the death of a loved one, a chronic illness, or a racist encounter. But what remains constant is the moral. A bad thing happened to me, but it made me a good person. This is
Yeah, I feel damn. like the scary thing, in my personal experience too, is it makes you feel bad for the good you've seen and the good you feel. For example, in my particular situation, growing up in Lesotho, my family were middle class, everything middle class. So I did go to a private university, private school, and all that stuff. Obviously with richer kids, but my parents did all they could. But I never felt like I was struggling. There were more people struggling more than I did. There were smarter people that were more smarter than me, that had less opportunities. So like whenever we present it in this light, it's like, yeah, even though on the like the absolute scale of like monetary value, like, yeah, I need the scholarship, for example, but in terms of like my quality of life, it's very comparable to someone who grew up in the status middle class. You have your own room, you get to do whatever, you never worry about what you gotta eat. You want the new PS4, you want the new whatever, you get, you can get all those things, even though, you know what I mean, even though, but then it, yeah. So but then the problem is when you start applying and like trying to escape, trying to interact with the rest of the Western world, for example. This, I mean, her opinion is from her growing up in Canada and everything like that. My opinion is from someone growing in a separate world. Everything was fine and groovy, but the minute you start applying yourself and joining this other side, it feels like you have to like over exaggerate your struggles, because they are obviously blatant struggles, and to be accepted, you can only be accepted as less than, because the minute you're like, oh, I'm just like you, it's not something that they would believe, for example. I don't know, but let me just let her talk.
Part of the larger phenomenon that I'm here to talk about today. The overwhelming pressure being put on high school students to write about their deepest traumas in their college applications, with the hopes that they seem resilient and interesting enough to be given a spot. I believe that these are not only bad metrics by which to evaluate applicants, but also incredibly harmful to the storyteller themselves and risks reinforcing existing inequities in higher education. There's also pressure that's being amplified by admissions counselors themselves, who play a huge role in influencing what applicants decide to write about. Take, for example, this tip from the MIT admissions blog, where the author compares two different introductions for a potential essay. The first one reads, "I'm honored to apply for the Master of Library Science program at the University of Okoboji. For as long as I can remember, I've had a love affair with books. Since I was 11, I've wanted to be a librarian." The second introduction reads, "When I was 11, my great aunt Gretchen passed away and left me something that changed my life, a library of about 5,000 books. Some of my best days were spent arranging and reading her books. Since then, I've wanted to become a librarian." The author notes that the second introduction is much more striking and leaves a much better impression. Consider another tip from collegeessayguide.com, where he advises students to get personal. He says, "Weirdly, including painful memories and what you learn from them usually helps a personal statement meet the goals of a college application essay. You come off as humble, accessible, likable, and mature." Confessions from admissions officers themselves can also be telling. Aya Waller-Bey, a former admissions officer from Georgetown University, said in a Forbes article that, "Within months on the job, I saw how the personal statements of Black and other racially minoritized students differed from those of white applicants. Black students highlighted resilience through stories of survival, while their counterparts wrote casual essays about service abroad and sporting championships. Black students shared their pain, white students shared their passions." Now, lastly, and perhaps
And I don't know if this is the point she's gonna make. It's like then you end up getting stuck in that, cause like when does it stop? Like when do you become, not to get too whatever, but when do you become someone that wins? You know what I mean? When does that start being the case? Because like I feel like at times you find yourself always trying to prove yourself about how much you've overcome, that you never actually get to thrive. And I think like the problem with this too, in my opinion, is like the light in which this institutions perceive less privileged individuals is as if the only way they can exist, their like reality has to be based on some trauma. So like whatever your parents had to do to give you the best life, in their eyes the only way you can be accepted is if you're like a flavor of trauma, a flavor of sadness, hardship, you know the oh, it's as if you always have to play to that role, as opposed to being like, you know what, yeah, I'm killing it right now, I'm good at this, I'm there at then, this is what I want to go. It's always where you're from, never where you want to go. And I think like that's the fundamental problem. It's like you get put in a box and people never actually care about what you want to do, what you're trying to do. It's always like where you're from, what it is. And, you know, obviously a lot of people end up making it about themselves. Like, oh yeah, I did a mission in whatever, trying to like take from what she's mentioned with like a lot of people have this extraordinary excursions, like, oh, I became this, I became that, I did this and I did that. But in actuality you find yourself that no, no, I still did the same, but I was already there. I solved the problem that was right in front of me, you know and I feel like that's a harder problem to solve than a problem whereby you already have like, oh yeah, I have the US dollar, my money can make more difference. But I don't know. I don't like complaining, but let's listen to her.
The least reliable source is my own life. I remember feeling this way when I was applying to universities. Like I had no other choice, no other experiences worthy of mentioning, and no other merit beyond the fact that I had thrived despite what I had gone through. I even remember worrying that my tale wouldn't be harrowing enough after hearing from a counselor that writing about immigration has become a bit of a cliche because of how overused it is. So,
You see, it's like you gotta be very entertaining. Even if that's your true story, you can't even use that story because it has been like the appetite of the institutions you're trying to get accepted into has kind of got used to it. Like, oh, give me better flavors of trauma, won't you? Give me something else. Like like it's. I hate saying but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. But listen to her, like she's spitting facts right now.
what's the university's role in all of this? And why are these stories even harmful to begin with? Well, I believe that using your college application essay to discuss your trauma actually doesn't help you process it. And there are a couple different reasons why. First, writing about a difficult experience is, as you may have guessed, difficult. Not only do you have to relive the event itself, but you also have to actively suppress any negative emotions that arise during the process. That kind of emotional labor can be taxing for anybody, but perhaps especially so for these young applicants who haven't had enough time on this world to process the terrible things that have happened to them. For that space to be one in which they're confessing to a faceless stranger who gets to make the most consequential decision of their adolescent life imposes an incredibly heavy psychological burden. I mean, imagine if you walked into your therapy appointment and your therapist tells you that they're not going to respond to anything you tell them except with a rejection or acceptance email sent months later. And also that whatever you tell them would determine the trajectory of your entire academic and professional career. Hard to imagine that being therapeutic. Secondly,
that analogy about how what's actually happening whenever you lay out everything that's happening or that has happened so that you can let yourself be known and you don't get the response right away, and it's actually like life or death for you, because that's what we all think before you grow up and realize, there's more to life or whatever. But in those moments, like the rejection, when you do get rejected, isn't just a rejection of like, oh, I got rejected here and I can just go to this other place. It's like maybe you're rejected because your trauma wasn't traumatic enough, and even worse, no one cares about your trauma because you made it about the trauma. Because like she said, it's a trauma essay, and it can fuck up a lot of people. It can fuck up a lot of people because, yeah, just because one university rejects you, there's other universities that are gonna accept you. But the problem is you've given opportunity to like random external factors and external people to determine your own resilience and your own life goals. I don't know.
Trauma essay makes one assumption that is extremely problematic. It's not always the learning opportunity through which you can gain more confidence or develop better time management skills. Sometimes it's just a sucky thing that really sucks. And asking students to prove how they turn their pain into progress ignores this truth and falls prey to the toxic positivity narrative that everything happens for a reason.
I don't know if you've seen Beef, but this is exactly what I feel like anyone who has dealt with partners that are overly positive or like people that are overly yippity in terms of like you can't even explain what you're actually going through because you just want them not to make it a, like people that make it about themselves. And I feel like in this case, I feel like it's drawing similar it's giving the same vibes, in the sense like a lot of people, it's like even when you go through therapy or whatever, it's almost like you're not actually participating to get ahead and solve it, but it's like just doing therapy is gonna change everything. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh yeah, then I'll be fine. And it's like you wanna be overly vulnerable. It's as if you're playing the game and like whatever, but deep down you're not actually opening yourself up because you just want the annoyingness of feeling like you're less than and weak to stop. And I know I'm just going off topic right now, but I feel like this extends so much beyond a lot of things, because it's like, tell us your drama. Yeah, how did you overcome? It's like there's like a timetable, you like a schedule. Yeah, when do you overcome? Fix yourself. It's like they want to know you're broken, but most importantly they want to know how quickly can you fix yourself. And like it doesn't happen that way, unfortunately. Like she says, traumatic things can be really traumatic.
Reason, ignoring the very valid resentment and anger that many victims still feel. Lastly, the things we write aren't just informed by our experiences, they shape how we view those experiences as well. And if we're writing about our trauma to prove to our admissions officer that we're worthy of a decent education, then it becomes necessary to sanitize our pain. To make it marketable and strategic, to scrub away all the suffering, so all that's left is what will fit into the narrow margins of what is palatable. And this is what I see as being the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the trauma essay. It seems to give the writer free rein of vulnerability, but actually leaves them very little room to be vulnerable. Your story has to be just sad enough that it gains sympathy, but not so sad that it makes you seem beyond help. Just critical enough to inspire change, but not so much that it actually criticizes systemic structures. Just honest enough to seem real, but not so unfiltered that it creates discomfort. The protagonist also overcomes whatever struggle they're facing.
So it's almost as if they want some Goldilocks trauma. Like you get, you know, it's like be vulnerable, but don't be too vulnerable. Be this, but not to this. Not it's like the whole process itself ends up becoming a traumatic experience itself, because now you're like, as opposed to dealing with your traumas, now you're judging how how beautiful a narrative your trauma can tell, and that irks me. That makes it very hard.
Basing by the end of the 500 word count, instilling the reader with a sense of optimism that despite our deeply unequal society, it is possible to rise through the ranks and overcome all the isms. This, of course, is not the reality of our world today. And for me, this looked like settling for the familiar story of the stinky lunch, one that's been told so many times that it's devoid of any real meaning. Instead of talking about the ongoing social and political disenfranchisement of immigrants, the permanent loss of cultural identity that I suffered, or the sense of disbelonging that's
The point about the culture that the cultural loss that she suffers, I feel like it's always going back to the whole Goldilocks. You gotta fit in perfectly. It's like it's like you have your identity be different, but assimilate and make it quick. You know, like whenever people's post videos of like racist people, or like they'll be like, oh yeah, this is America, speak English, da 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 da. It's always like in some Walmart supermarket somewhere, like an aggressive older individual or whatever. But what they fail to realize is like, even in those prestigious universities, those colleges, those internationally minded, all those situations, there's still a pressure for people to fit in. You know, how good is your English? Not even how good is your English. Your accent doesn't make me think you're smart enough. You know, it's tough. It's tough, but all right, let's keep it going. Let's keep it.
still haunts me every time I make a grammar mistake or someone mispronounces my name. These are all struggles that never really go away, but are carefully tucked away in my essay because they don't fit the linear narrative that is being constructed. But how are universities to blame for all of this? I mean, they never explicitly ask students to trauma dump in their essays, and many admissions experts have actually come out and discouraged discussing explicit trauma in essays. However, I still don't think that universities are blameless. The reason why the trauma essay is so ubiquitous is because it seems to be working. Anne Trebek, who helped low-income high school students at Oberlin College write their essays, expresses the ethical dilemma that she faces. By pushing students to reveal their horror stories, I risk taking away their dignity. But by not pushing, I could be hindering their chances of getting into their dream schools. Whether trauma essays and acceptance letters are actually causally correlated is impossible to tell from the outside, so this could all just be speculation and myth. But in failing to resolutely clear up these speculation and myths about whether trauma essays are rewarded or discouraged, universities are indirectly enabling the rise of the trauma essay and all of its harmful implications. So, what are they to do about all of this? Well, first of all, I think that this is a problem that goes much deeper than individual universities, and even perhaps the institution of higher education itself. It's rooted in the cultural obsession with appropriating trauma and making it consumable, as well as the systemic tendency to tokenize oppressed people and their experiences. But
Yeah, it's weird. It's almost as if it's entertaining more than anything. It's almost as if in that drab, boring, predictable lives that each individual lives, it's almost as if you have a story that's sad enough but not too sad that it's upsetting, it's just entertaining, unfortunately. And I hate reducing experiences and life lessons just to that. But unfortunately, that's what happens most of the time. People's traumas are treated as like entertainment and kind of like makes them unique and less boring. That's why it's always weird. Like whenever you feel like, oh, everything has been very perfect, like, oh, I can't succeed in life or whatever. Because even the narrative that is presented in the world is always like overcoming, coming from this, you gotta overcome, you gotta this. It's almost as if whenever you have a comfortable situation and environment to grow in, you're less of a human being. Even in the things you attain or achieve are less than just because you happen not to go through the worst of the West, I guess. But just keep
There are
it pushing.
still things that universities can do to make things better. First, they can be more transparent about their admissions guidelines. If it's really true that they don't want to reward trauma storytelling just for the sake of it, then they should be more forthcoming about this expectation. They could also restructure their prompts to avoid putting pressure on students to talk about past hardships and adversities, and instead refocus prompts to ask students about their goals for the future and their academic interests. Secondly,
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. It's it's like it's that's something that if enough effort is put into it can be put in. That way you actually know the students that are coming to the university, not the not who they were, like who raised them, who's it's like actually you get to know who you get to predict what the future of your school, the kind of people that are coming as opposed to like what they just happen to go through, because it doesn't really tell much, because the things we go through in life don't necessarily tell us a lot about anything, to be honest. But
admissions counselors should be trauma informed and trained in working with BIPOC folk. As the unofficial gatekeepers to the secrets of getting into your dream college, they should wield their power responsibly and not pressure students to talk about traumatic experiences that they're not yet ready to talk about. Lastly, and this one's for anyone who's actually applying to a post-secondary institution sometime soon, remember that you are more than the bad things that happen to you. I know that when it seems like every other classmate of yours is writing an essay that could be adapted for an HBO original drama, that you may feel like your experiences are not worth talking about. But I promise that they are. You just have to find your voice and use it. Now, as much as I don't want to live that nail-bitingly stressful time of my life ever again, I can't help but wonder, what would I have written about if I got the chance to apply to UBC again? This time absent the pressure to strategically use my immigrant background to gain sympathy points. Maybe I would have written about how I overcame my fear of public speaking and became comfortable with being the loudest voice in the room. Or I could have written about watching trashy reality television is what first sparked my interest in political science. Or maybe I still would have written about my immigrant story, because that was a big part of my life journey and still impacts me to this day. But I would have done it on my own terms. Instead of being written as a one-dimensional trauma-turned-triumph drama, I would have been able to tell a story that actually reflects who I am today, and acknowledge the fact that my journey is ongoing and it doesn't begin or end with my racial identity. This is the kind of ownership that I wish for everyone to one day have over their story. And now it's up for universities to decide whether they get to tell it.
well said, well spoken. Wow, this is approaching 30 minutes. If you're still here right now, you're a real one. But yeah, wow. I think the perspective that she took were a lot of things that I didn't anticipate, and some maybe I kind of empathized. Yeah, and I feel like beyond just universities and whatever, I feel like in general, even in life, uh, let's be less likely to present our weakest selves. I know there's this notion that, especially for men, to like overcome toxic masculinity behaviors by being vulnerable and stuff. But then at the same time, you also got to realize if you're trying to be super vulnerable for acceptance, it puts a lot of pressure on other people and also on yourself, because if you get rejected in your vulnerability, who knows what's going to happen to you. And also at the same time, you don't just give yourself to anyone and be vulnerable to everyone. So I don't know, tread carefully and always remember you're more than your traumas. And yeah, if people only care about your traumas, then try to ask yourself if you are a person to them or you're just entertainment and a little spice to their lives. Okay.